meaningless in your life. Perhaps you actually do want to rule the world, and that's why you've come. Either you feel conflicted in your ambition, or you came to be persuaded out of it, or you want to argue with me that in fact wanting to rule the world is good and valuable and important, and anyone who can do it should do it. Another possibility is that you don't want to rule the world, but you want to hear about why other people, those people who really annoy you, they drive you nuts with their constant driving ambition and their lust for power. You want me to hear about why those people are wrong to want to rule the world. Wouldn't that be satisfying to hear about that? Unfortunately, I'm not going to let you, that part of the audience, off either, because this talk is not really about ruling the world primarily. It's about, I mean, I'm not an expert on ruling the world. I've never ruled the world myself. I've dreamt of it often, but I've never done it. So I don't have any experiences to draw on. What this talk is really about is ambition. That is what can go wrong with ambition, and success, which is never what we think it is. So whether or not you identify as a future ruler of the world, I'm confident that you are ambitious and that you want to succeed. Perhaps you are riddled with doubts as to whether your ambitions can be realized and whether you will ever reach the success that you crave. If so, I hope the argument of this talk will bring you some relief. There's more to life than success. So I thought I'd begin by asking you a question, and this is for each of you individually. What do you think is essential? If you had to choose one thing that was essential to the best human life, what would it be? What must, if you're thinking about a good, flourishing, happy life, what must it above all contain? I'm using, can you not hear me? Okay. Oh, you know, I think you're asking me to enunciate better, and I take the point. I will work on it. I'm asking you what you think is essential to the best human life. What good or goods would you think, if you had to pick one, you could not be happy without? You could not, your life would not count as a good life, as a flourishing life, as a fully human life, if you did not have this one thing, this one grand, beautiful thing. I think it's an important question to ask oneself from time to time, and I'll tell you a story to get us thinking about it. It's a story we were talking about just now with some students. The story of Croesus, the king of Lydia, the 5th century BC. Lydia is a region of modern day Turkey. And his story is told by Herodotus, who is the one of the earliest prose texts of ancient Greek that we have, who wrote a history full of wonderful, hilarious stories, anecdotes, ironic reflections, and also an account of the war between the Greeks and the Persians. But this is at the beginning. So Croesus, whose story Herodotus tells, was enormously successful. So successful that one still hears the phrase, "as rich as Croesus," although less often maybe than in previous generations. At the peak of his success, his capital city of Sardis attracts wise men and other ancient celebrities from across the Mediterranean. Among them comes Solon of Athens, a successful man in his own right, who is traveling after undertaking a major reform of the laws of ancient Athens. Croesus, seeking recognition from Solon of his majestic success, asks him who on earth he thinks is the happiest man. Who is the man who is living the best life? This is also an interesting question for us to ask. Of the people you know or of you've heard of, who's living the best life? There's some microphones here which are running against my paper. Sorry about that. Croesus asks Solon who's the happiest person. Solon names an ordinary, simple man who has children and dies young honorably in battle at the peak of his success, having done everything a human being ought to do, have children and acquire honor in battle. Croesus is irritated and he says, we have who's the second happiest? After that, who's the second happiest? And Solon tells another story about two ordinary people who, when the oxen are unavailable, they take their mother to the miles and miles away to the temple for her sacrifices by hand. It's so exhausting. They get there to a celebration for their piety, for their devotion, for their love of their mother, for their strength. And the ordeal is such that they go to sleep and don't wake up. That's the end of their lives. That's the second happiest person, according to Solon. When Croesus demands an explanation, Solon gives an elaborate calculation of the number of days in a human life and says that none of those days, not all 35,000 of them or whatever it is, none of those days is like any other. One never knows what's coming. Accordingly, Solon says, taking it to its logical extreme, like a good philosopher, a person cannot be judged happy until they are dead. Solon puts it in a proverbial form. A human being is what happens to them. Shortly after the conversation with Solon, Croesus's life takes a turn. His oldest son dies in a tragic accident. Egged on by a misunderstanding of some crucial oracles, Croesus decides to attack Cyrus, the king of Persia. Sorry, I was about to say the Persians and Persia, I got mixed up. He loses, Croesus does. As the soldiers sack his capital city, carrying away all of his life's acquisitions and the acquisitions of his ancestors, Kingdom of Lydia is at this point 1,000 years old. Croesus is its last king. So as all of this is being borne away by the king of Persia, the conquering king of Persia, Croesus himself is put on a pyre to be burned. He cries, "Oh, Solon," suddenly remembering the wisdom of his friend. He realizes, in other words, that his happiness has come to an end. And it has come to an end when he's still relatively young and has much of his life yet to be lived. A curious Cyrus, as he calls out this name, Solon, saves his life. And Croesus spends the rest of his days dispensing his hard-won wisdom to his conqueror. So the story of Croesus is a version of a story told often in traditions coming from the ancient Near East. The tone is not always so lighthearted as Herodotus's tone is. So Agamemnon, who is the king of Mycenae, victor of a 10-year-long war with Troy, comes home laden with riches to be murdered by his wife, whose lover seizes power. In the Hebrew Psalms, the Psalms of the Hebrew Bible, the psalmist says, "I have seen a wicked man," which I think means actually a powerful, successful man in the context of the Psalms. "I have seen him towering like a cedar of Lebanon. I turned to look again and he was gone." Success does not last. Is there something wrong with it? Have Croesus and others like him made a mistake in seeking to rule the world? Is there an error in their conception of happiness, their conception of the good life? Does Solon correct it, or does he reinforce it? I'm going to put those questions there and I'll circle back to them a bit later. There are other famous accounts of the failures of success. Not just that it comes to an end, that even when one has it, it doesn't measure up. Most famous reading for this topic is the book of Ecclesiastes, also in the Hebrew Bible, which is written in the voice of King Solomon, the most wealthy, successful, and well-reputed king of the Hebrew Bible, of the Israelite people. He did not lose his power or his wealth, and yet he judges all of it to be vanity or emptiness. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. What there was, that will be. What was done, that will be done. But there is nothing new under the sun. Grand palaces and gardens, fine wine and beautiful women, all amount to nothing. Even wisdom, the gift for which Solomon is most renowned, is pointless, since the wise man and the fool go to the same place, the grave. Just make a quick side point here before continuing to the rest of my talk. We think Ecclesiastes is written from the emptiness of all things, from the perspective of the wealthiest, wisest, most powerful man in King of Israel. And his words are echoed nowhere more closely than the story of Job, which is the story of a man who loses absolutely everything. He's wealthy, he's successful. It's another Croesus story. Wealthy, successful, has 12 children, loses everything, and then has to face what his life was really about. So there's something funny about these two people, one the pinnacle of success and one the pinnacle of failure, coming to agreement about their perspective on the world. Now, these stories I've just told you sound very old, I think, probably to many of us. Ruling the world in this context, like King Solomon, King Croesus, it's always a king in this context. It seems clunky and complicated, requires armies, horses, the risk of death, things which might be quite distant from our contemporary lives. Now, perhaps some of you have the opportunity, interest in for military ambitions or even royal ambitions. Even so, I think it's a world that's quite different than the one that is described in these ancient texts. So I think my guess as to what you all might say, and I assume perhaps wrongly that many of you were students. Many of you are, maybe not all of you. So this talk is definitely a student-directed talk, but I hope that you, elders like me, will also get something out of it. I mean, success matters to us too. So my guess is that what you all might say, as I said earlier, is that you want to succeed. And maybe you would also use words like make a difference. We'd like to make a difference. And I wonder if these are the two ways nowadays that it might seem polite or normal or respectable to rule the world, to be successful, to make a difference. Now, what could possibly be wrong with success, pursuing success, or wanting to make a difference? So this is the section I'll get into now. The problem is that these ideas both turn out to be more complicated than they seem. What is success? One can succeed at chess, football, gambling, elaborate and cruel forms of crime. Does it matter what one succeeds at? What our area of success is in? What about making a difference? A similar question appears. We don't want to make just any difference. We want to make a positive difference. We want to make a good difference. We want to make the world better. So what is a good difference? And how can one be sure that one is making one? More stories, I think, are in order here. So these next stories concern people who spent large chunks of their lives in what some would call failure. So there are 4 different lives here. I'm just going to toss them out. In fact, maybe I'm taking longer to talk than I thought, so maybe I'll give you all 4. Why not? Just it's you know, Christmas is coming. It's October. So here's the first. The Russian dissident Irina Ratushinskaya used poetry as a form of resistance during her imprisonment by the Soviet authorities in the early 1980s. On the transport train to the prison, at any point of contact with the other prisoners, she would recite poems, original or classic. Memorized poems were written out on scraps of paper and exchanged between prisoners. When Ratushinskaya was denied writing materials by her captors, she scratched her poems onto bars of soap with matchsticks and would wash them away after she had memorized them. She transferred them to cigarette paper, the only paper available when she could, and they were smuggled out of prison to be published in the West. Romanian author Irina Dumitrescu writes about Romanian political prisoners who undertook similar endeavors in prison. They taught each other Morse code and tapped each other poetry to the walls. They taught each other languages. They made ink out of blackberries and wrote out poems they'd memorized in school. So these incredible lives that are lived under what you might think were the worst possible conditions. Imprisonment, unjust imprisonment by a cruel and indifferent authority. So here's another second kind of example. The African-American activist Malcolm X entered prison as a man named Malcolm Little. He was a defiant hedonist, addicted to drugs, reliant on petty crime. His father had been murdered by white men when he was a child, and his family subsequently broken up by the local welfare office. Long studies in the prison library and conversations with a self-educated inmate changed him. Malcolm began to read first the dictionary, then books on etymology and linguistics. He studied elementary Latin and German. He converted to Islam, a faith brought to him by his brothers. And in the following years, he read the Bible, the Quran, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Spinoza, and Kant, as well as works of Asian philosophy. He learned the history of colonialism, slavery, and of African peoples. He felt, and these are his words, he felt his old ways of thinking disappear like snow off a roof. He left prison as a minister in the Nation of Islam and a powerful spokesman for the African-American communities most beaten down by the poverty and violence fed by racial prejudice. That's the second example. So we have Irina Ratushinskaya, the poet. We have Malcolm X, the activist. We have three, Albert Einstein. Are there any grad students here by any chance? Okay. Einstein was unable to find an academic job. You should always remember this. Always remember this. So he looked and looked. He couldn't get along with his dissertation advisor. No one wanted him around. So he took a job in a patent office because he had a wife and a child. He had to support them. And it was in that office, isolated from academic contacts, that he wrote the three 1905 papers that turned physics upside down. He called that office the worldly cloister where I hatched all my most beautiful ideas. Okay, that's the third. Here's a fourth, John Baker. John Baker lived in the mid 20th century. He died in the 1970s, I think. He was a lover of literature without a college degree. He worked at an office job at the Automobile Association of Essex. This is the British equivalent of AAA. Probably a pretty mechanical, boring job, I'm guessing. In his spare time, he stalked peregrine falcons over the countryside in Essex on a bicycle. He did this for 10 years, carrying maps, taking voluminous notes, and then he consolidated his work into the 1967 poetic masterpiece called The Peregrine. These are our four examples. We have Irina Ratushinskaya, the poet, Malcolm X, the activist, Albert Einstein, the scientist, John Baker, the studier of birds, and also a kind of poet. Are these men and women successful? The simple answer is yes. Ratushinskaya was a famous poet. Malcolm X was a great activist. Einstein, the most famous scientist of the 20th century. And even John Baker, not well known, but he did at least publish a book. As I was explaining to the students earlier, who I was talking to, it's hard to find examples of beautiful failed lives that are complete failures because no one writes about them. so you have to be successful at some point to get a book written about you, and then you have to speculate out and try to separate out the parts that would count as failure from the parts that might count as success. So these examples are useful because each of these people had a time when they were doing the work that mattered most to them, without success, without money, without recognition. Were they successful then? Was Ruchashinskaya successful before if her poems had never left Siberia? If Malcolm X had never made a speech, but had simply had this transformative experience and read all of these books and felt his old ways of thinking disappear like snow off a roof? Einstein, before he published a paper, when he's sitting in his patent office thinking about physics, are they successful then? I think they are. But I think to think that way is really to encounter something in us and something in our culture that is very powerful and very hard to resist. So I'll just say, this is a bit off the cuff, but these four people seem to be most of all to be free people. So success isn't actually the first word I'd use for them, but I'm thinking about success in other contexts, I'm applying it. Their lives, even at the darkest parts, display freedom. And that's strange, since most of them, 3 out of 4, or 2 out of 4, they're prisoners. They have highly restricted choices. It's a strange kind of freedom that a prisoner can keep, or a person in a low-end office job might have, or a freedom that a grad student who can't get a job might have. What would count as slavery if these people are free? Okay, I'm going to drink some of this red punch, and the talk will become very different after this. Oh my gosh, everything. The whole world is transformed. It's amazing. What's in this drink, Professor Merrill? Let's return to thinking about success and about making a difference. Now, again, we know it's not making any difference, making a positive difference. Now, say I cook someone who's having a bad day a nice dinner. Have I made a difference? How about if I clean the bathroom for my family? An empty stomach and a dirty bathroom are problems. They make people miserable. Fixing them makes a difference. Now, those are just single actions, but what about whole professions or whole ways of life? Bathrooms here on this campus also need to be cleaned. They're cleaned by people who do that full-time work. Do they make a difference? Or the people who empty the trash cans, or the people who prepare and serve you food? To me, it's obvious that they do. They obviously make a difference. They provide the goods that make human life possible and bearable. Yet these jobs and the people who do them are not valued. They're not dubbed with the tag of success. And they're not paid well or treated well. So we could try to figure out, if we were economists, as probably half of you are. Where I come from at St. John's, no one's an economist, but there's maybe one person who knows something. But here, the room's been full of them. But figure out whether they're not paid well because they're low prestige, or whether they're low prestige because they're not paid well. That's an interesting question that I would ask someone who knew more about it. Well, whatever it is, it seems to me it doesn't really make sense. I don't know if it makes sense to you. Is it possible that someone could be successful, that is doing work that really matters, work that makes a difference, and yet not have their success recognized? At the other hand, there are many jobs with high prestige and very low social use. Sociologist David Graeber has called them bullshit jobs. This is a book that came out in, I think, about 2018. A bullshit job is distinguished from what he calls a shit job. A shit job is a job of the kind I've just described, where your work is extremely important, but you're treated very badly. These are the opposite. They're work where you're paid well, you're given all the trappings of success, you have a beautiful title, a high salary, you can live in a beautiful place, you can impress people at cocktail parties when you give them your incomprehensible job title. But what you do makes no sense. It provides for no human need. Here's a couple of examples. That's the best thing about Graeber's book is the examples. He wrote a short online essay about bullshit jobs, and then he got hundreds of letters from all over the world. And the letters are what makes the book. It's the stories of these people who are in these real situations. So one example is he's a subcontractor to a subcontractor in the military. And his job is to drive long distances to move furniture from one room to another and fill out the appropriate paperwork for the transfer of the furniture from one room to another. There's a more poignant, it's the story of a man who was hired to patch a problem that the higher authorities in the company do not want solved. So one person in authority wants the problem solved, the other one doesn't. So the compromise is they hire someone not to solve it. He's paid very well to do literally nothing. He starts out reading novels. Then he starts drinking at work, taking phony work trips, trying to get himself fired. He tries to resign, he's offered a raise. His job is a necessary pretense for his superiors. They cannot let him go. And what's fascinating about the stories that Graeber collects, like this one, that's the best story. I think he finally just escapes, like he leaves a note, just leaves, because no one will accept his resignation. Anyway, so he does finally get out of that job. But what's fascinating about a story like that, and all the stories he collects, is that these workers are deeply unhappy, despite having prestige and wealth, and very little to do. It seems that their hearts really long for real work, for service, or for a connection with their communities. They long for is to provide some human good. Now, how does one find oneself in a bullshit job? It may not be hard to imagine. It may be close by to many of us. Most of us these days are either in one or near to one if you're in our middle class world. I think the force, I like to call it autopilot. You go to college and then you go to grad school. It's because everyone you know is doing it. You study the things that seem like the right thing to study. You belong to a social group or a social class, or you aspire to belong to it. And so you do what they do. And that's not a bad thing in itself. That's the way we all learn anything, or the way we all develop as human beings. But it has to be looked at with some care. So education is necessary for formal education, I mean, for most forms of work that bring either money, a comfortable lifestyle, or for social status. Now, sometimes this straightforward motivation is taken up honestly, in which case there's something wrong with it. But is there something wrong with saying, I want a job of a certain comfort level, and this particular course is the way to do it, I'm going to do it. It doesn't always happen that way. There's sometimes these grand conceptions that they hide behind. Not long ago, I came across a prestigious research institution that had made its way into the news. I'm not going to name it. It's an old story anyway. Their research projects included converting the patterns of nature in the human body into beneficial signals and energy, designing wearable systems for cognitive enhancement, advancing justice in Earth's complex systems using designs enabled by space. If those words made any sense to you, then you're different than me. The flavor is gimmicky and slick. It's not obvious whether any life would be improved by such projects, much less a community. Where do these things come from? They come from money, via prestige, via the language of the media splash, and the public relations coup. It sounds good to wealthy people or to people who publish things, and so it exists. To be dedicated to this kind of success is not to rule the world at all. It is rather to live under a kind of unfreedom, to get back to the freedom theme. living at the beck and call of others to orders which do not make sense. Now, Professor Merrill had an insight into Croesus earlier, or helped me have one. I don't know which of us gave birth to it, which is that here he is, he's the king of an incredibly wealthy kingdom at the pinnacle of its power. Why does he need to know someone else to tell him that he's happy? And there's something about, I think, this type of life, that living for success, which makes you dependent on those judgments of others. You don't have anything within yourself to judge that you're happy. That's not what it means. Success is a relative term. It's success to somebody, success for somebody, and that somebody needs to tell you that you've got it or you don't have it. That's part of why I think those other stories, the 4 stories of the people who spend a certain amount of their life in failure, why those stories are so beautiful is because those people, I think, don't need outside recognition. They get outside recognition. That's not why they're living for. That's not why they're doing what they're doing. They're running by something they recognize in themselves. They're able to do that. And then they receive recognition later, which is why their fame or their success doesn't seem to have the same flavor as someone like Croesus, or a bullshit person with a bullshit job, or someone who has a research project that involves creating justice systems from space. So to be dedicated, okay, so okay. So if you work in these contexts, which I've described, your work is for the ends of others. You're not a mere cog in a machine. This is what people used to say back in the 20th century when I was born. The complaint was always about being a cog in the machine, but being a cog in the machine means being a part of something that's producing some good. It's a different kind of a thing. I mean, it's a problem. It's a way of reducing a human being to something else, but it's not itself as bad as the kind of thing I think we're talking about. You're being used to create an appearance that makes someone money, and you get some of that money yourself. No salary and no degree of social standing, it seems to me, could compensate for this kind of human diminishment if it's taken for what it is. Contrast that with things which probably are also real opportunities that are available now. Learning how to build homes or offices or bridges or roads, or making communities safe or sanitary or comfortable or beautiful. These are all still real human needs. And there's a variety of types of work that can be done in them. Despite the overwhelming importance of useful work like this, so there's the non-useful work, there's bullshit work, there's useful work, and even the useful work, I want to say, is not sufficient for a full human life. So now we're getting a little closer to the human good. That's because if that's all we do, we run the risk of being mere functionaries, being cogs in the machine, helping the community run without being real members of it. We can work for the ends of others even there without receiving the goods that we produce ourselves. So you could think of the home healthcare aide who can't afford health insurance. It's an example of someone who's working for the good of the community, but not receiving something for themselves. So the truth is that, if I can kind of step back and try to take a broader view for a second, we're exposed to different professions and professional training without reference to the ultimate good that they serve, or without careful thinking about the good that they serve. Am I building an apartment complex for people to live in, or an investment complex that will make the investors money while the market is high, but will be left an empty eyesore in a matter of months? One form of building serves the common good, the other might not. Is the healthcare I'm learning to practice focused on healing the sick, improving the lives of the disabled, providing comfort to the elderly? Or is it a form of cosmetics or eugenics for the rich to distinguish themselves from everyone else? These are essential questions. They're specific questions which are forms of much more general fundamental questions. Questions, as I asked you earlier, about what kinds of things make a life good, what kinds of things make a human being flourish, and what kinds of things are essential in guiding us towards something that looks like a human life that's could be worse, not too bad, has its value within itself. This kind of reflection is nurtured by the kind of learning that the Lincoln Scholars Program nurtures. We call it liberal learning, learning for freedom. And liberal learning of the kind that I'm concerned with was conceived and developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the large and growing class of laborers and immigrants sought to improve their lives by appropriating to themselves the learning of the aristocrats through the great books and the classics. So great books and classics are sometimes thought to be this kind of elite aristocratic thing. And that was true. It's been true for a good chunk of human history. But the most recent history is something quite different. It's the appropriation of that education democratically for everybody to advance themselves and to feed the kinds of reflections on fundamental questions and the best way of living that I've been promoting in this talk. This whole movement was aided by the printing technology, which permitted the mass market paperback, vast industry in translating classics into English. That meant that books reserved for centuries for a few could suddenly become available to everyone. So liberal learning relies on the print. This history of liberal education, I think, matters because it's a testimony to the nature of the kind of freedom that we're talking about. It's the fact that this was chosen by people in diminished circumstances, who were in poverty, who were exploited, who had were subject to labors of various kinds, and that through this reading and reflection and conversation and community building, they were able to find something of their own dignity in it that was denied them by their work circumstances, by their cultural and social circumstances. And that to me is a version of something that happens to any of us, whether we come from a diminished or oppressed background or not, because it's this process of finding within oneself the capacity to exercise one's judgment, to judge one's own activity, sort of speak from what's within itself, in the same way that our figures of failure, of suffering and endurance did. So the poet Irina Rozhdestvskaya, the activist Malcolm X, the scientist Albert Einstein, and the naturalist John Baker. So liberal learning relies on the principle that I am most free when I exist for my own sake, when I have an activity which further develops me and makes me into a different kind of person than I would be otherwise. And that has its, as I keep saying, you recognize it when you experience it. It doesn't have to be given by others. It's training for success, but also training for failure. Now, if I go back to Solon and Croesus and ask myself what went wrong in their conception, I think I can now see that they're both of them thinking about their flourishing, their happiness as something which is determined by chance and by the approval of others. So if you read this passage, which you should, it's fabulous, in Book 1 of Herodotus, Solon tells these two stories about these ordinary people. They both die, the ordinary people, surrounded by acclaim and glory. So they get that recognition, and then they die quickly so that they don't ever have to see it disappear the way that Croesus does. This is just a feature of success. It comes and goes. It's a matter of chance. And I don't think it's quite true that a human being is what happens to him, as Solon says. But I think it can be like that if we don't choose to cultivate ourselves, our inner lives, by reading and by reflection and conversation and community. And that's the kind of freedom that I think the right kind of education aims for. I'm going to end my remarks there, at risk of going on too long. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zena. Is this on? People here? We're going to take questions and we're going to bring the microphone around. And Sunyata, maybe I'll give you that other microphone. We can work the ties through it. I think that we've got Chaitanya back there.
Hello, Dr. Hitz. It was lovely to listen to you talk. My question kind of melds two ideas that you presented. One is this idea of like the freedom to, find satisfaction in something you're doing internally within yourself, and not seeking success as an, external factor through validation from others and things like that. And the other part of it was the idea that there's these, bullshit jobs or bullshit ideas that, don't contribute to society in any way. I feel often that social scientists or just people interested in the humanities don't share the same visions of science that that scientists do, and often like I don't understand theoretical physics or any value that it adds to our lives. But I think there's a place that it does. Do you think that don't you think that those two ideas clash when we talk about someone like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos sending these spaceships to, like literally blasting off billions of dollars into space, when, as I would agree with you, they could use it to serve the people right here who are suffering. But I think they're able to do that because they are completely satisfied in the choices they're making and the freedom that comes with it. And they're not seeking external validation or happiness because externally there's millions of people crying for them to do something else with that money.
Oh, that's interesting. I think that those people that you're mentioning, and I agree, I'm on board with what your attitude towards them. I think they're in Croesus's position. So they're at the top of the world. Only in a way, I don't know. I think it's hard to have a grip on something like the history of the world. It's not something that's really very easy to understand. People have tried, people like me, like bookworm type people, have tried to come up with stuff like that, and it doesn't always work. But of course, like Lydia was a big country, but I think people like the kinds of people that we have now, these single figures, are probably more powerful, relatively speaking, than the King of Lydia was in the 5th century. But I do think that their success is dependent on others. So they're very dependent on their media profiles, their freedom from scandal, their shared opinion of their shareholders. They live and die by the stock market. They live and die on rumors and scandals, and all kinds of contingencies. Now, what's hard about the kind of point I'm trying to make about success is that there are some people that are really good at it, and they seem to be virtually immune. So, someone like Jeff Bezos, he's got his fingers into everything. I mean, what contingency could possibly take him down? Maybe only his own death, which we will all face someday. Not just his, but ours also. We all going to. He's a shared fate with all of us. It's worth remembering that. But it is externally determined. And one of the things that is dangerous, I didn't get into this part of it because I like to talk about these things from a perspective of someone seeking what's good for them, and not necessarily from a perspective of morality, traditionally speaking. But I think that the danger of pursuing the success type life is that it's so intoxicating when you're in the middle of it that you can't see what's wrong with it. So when you choose that kind of path, you're making a decision that shapes the way that you're going to see the world and the kinds of values that you're going to have down the line. And what's scary about being a young person is that you have the choice to go down a path like that and end up really not being able to see what's going on, and not being able to hear. So I think people like that, they don't hear the people, that you're talking about who might find a more effective use for the billions of dollars. So I think that's one of the things that's worth thinking about, and even just raising as a question, what kinds of lives are most open to receiving new information about what's going on? How open is my life to a recognition that I'm making a mistake, even a major mistake? How insulated am I from suffering I might be causing? Those are just questions to reflect on, and that's no matter what your walk of life is. We can all end up, they're very big and famous, but anyone can end up in that kind of situation, even on a smaller scale. Anyway, thanks for your question. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I have a question. You're talking about these bullshit jobs, and one of the people in my life kind of live in one of those. They're a tax attorney for an oil firm. So they're not necessarily adding to anything in society, but they're living a fulfilled, happy life because they take that money and they use it for their kids. They have good relationships, which make a fulfilled life. So you talk about success and fulfilledness in terms of jobs, but can't jobs sometimes not be like the focus of your life? And does that change success, the meaning of success?
Yeah, that's a perfect question. And if it's the kind of thing that I probably would have talked about if I had talked on for longer. So yes, you're right. So a lot of people choose the kind of work they choose because of the kind of family life they want to have. And in that case, the way that I think about it is, so I follow Aristotle, who thought that whether you know it or not, there's one thing that's your highest priority, your highest value, the thing that structures your life. So if that's your family, it's not like that removes you from moral responsibility for what kind of work you do, but you're not as vulnerable to the kind of problem I'm talking about in the talk, because your life is meaningful. It's constituted by these loving relationships and by bonds of mutual care. There's still a question as to whether there are better or worse ways of doing it. Whether you have if you have a variety of ways of bringing about this end, are you choosing the best one? But I think that the point I'm trying to make is not that certain kinds of jobs are terrible and should never be undertaken. It's more that you don't want to live for those kinds of jobs. And anyone might have to. I mean, it's easy to imagine, right? That and many of you may already be in the situation or have been in it. You just have to take a bullshit job. It's just your best option. You've got to have some revenue. You have to have some income, and that's the one that's right in front of you. That's going to be best for you and your family. There's nothing wrong with you for doing that. The kind of thing I'm thinking about is more the culture of success, where what the real focus of your life is this kind of making an impact on the perceptions of others. And I think anyone who has something in their life that's grounding has a better chance of engaging in some serious reflection and putting things together, even if that doesn't seem to happen. So, and there are also sometimes there are real disagreements about how to achieve good things. I don't want them to paint those over either. So thank you very much for your question. Excellent.
Hi, Dr. Hitz.
Hello.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Sure.
So I think implicit in your talk, and especially in the first life that you talk about, which is like the Russian dissident in the prison camp producing poetry, is this emphasis on like suffering and failure. And it seems like there needs to be a moment of failure in order for you to kind of figure out what you want from your life, your good life. And I was wondering how that compares to like Eastern conceptions of happiness, because in like Buddhism and in like the Vedic concept of the good life is a liberation from suffering. And so I was wondering how you would compare like eudaimonia to something like nirvana, and what the role of suffering is in the good life in general. Thank you.
No, thank you. That's also a great question. I've never studied the Eastern traditions, and I'm always a little cautious about wading in and saying something that sounds smart about an ancient tradition that I've really not. Part of spending time on a tradition like I have with, say, the ancient Greek tradition is that you learn how rich and complex it is, and you don't want to just go wallowing into someone else's tradition that you don't know as well and make claims about it. But if I take just what you're saying about it, that do we want to suffer or do we want release from suffering? I think in my talk, I have some other work where I'm much more pro-suffering than this particular talk. I didn't think, I want to start you guys off kind of soft. don't want to bring it on too quickly that suffering is in fact the final end of it. No, but I think that regardless of what you think the ultimate value of suffering is, which I think is the disagreement that you're talking about, you still, it still has a value in the following sense. One, it's an inevitable part of every human life. It cannot be avoided, ever, by anyone. Don't ever believe anyone if they say they can do it. But secondly, it helps us it puts us under pressure to find within ourselves the things that really matter to us. So that's an instrumental use of suffering. It's not suffering as an end in itself. So I think it's compatible with thinking that suffering is something that you escape from. It just has a kind of clarifying effect in the kinds of stories that I'm talking about. And it's a really interesting question to me. It's something I continue to puzzle over why that should be the case. Why can't we just figure out what's important to us and get our clarity without suffering? Wouldn't that be nice? But it doesn't seem to be the way things work. I don't know if that helps. Thank you. Not quite, actually. But if you talk very loudly, yeah. Well, I don't think I enunciated. I think what you want to do, not to enunciate, but to project. Very well. Yeah, very good.
How do you feel about people that persuasion virtually?
Right. It depends a bit on the context of the persuasion. I think the way that I'm thinking about it, you undergo some kind of suffering, as happens to all of us inevitably. I thought you were going to ask about choosing it, but you didn't. So someone else can ask that if they want. And how do you communicate, given that your standard is within yourself? Yeah. So you're doing something that really matters to you, and you know it. Right. That's part of the condition of freedom that I'm interested in. How do you go about persuading someone else that it's working for you, or that they should try it? It's part of the question. Let's do both. So it's often a painful thing when it's just a matter of persuading someone else that it's working for you. And it can take a long time. But if you're talking about a situation where, say it's a personal relationship, okay, a family relationship, a spouse type relationship, romantic relationship, if the person cares about you and sees you flourishing, right, then that's, it tends to work in the long term to persuade them that it's better for you. Now, there's something else which happens, which I think happens in all of these cases I talk about, where they don't just, these people, the 4 people, they don't just persuade themselves that they don't just find something that matters to them, that's meaningful to them, but they communicate, they manage to convince other people to publish their papers, to invite them to give speeches, to publish their poems, to recognize the value of what they're doing for its own sake, right? So it's a bit of a paradox, right? It's not pursuing other people's opinion for its own sake. It's pursuing what you want to do for your own sake, but that other people are drawn in. They're inspired by it. They like it. It means something to them. That I think can't be controlled, but it happens sometimes. And it's a good thing when it happens. It's a sign that human beings are not all that different from one another, right? So there's some differences, but there's also a lot of similarities. So if you're finding some activity that really matters to you, that's meaningful to you, that's grounding your life, chances are there's someone else in the world who it's going to resonate with. Probably not just one person, but a number of people. And that's an encouragement to them who may be also struggling against various pressures to do it. So that's all. It's a corny word. I've been using it more and more, so I need to watch myself. But it's almost like an organic process. So you're living your life. You're doing what you care about, and other people come around and react to it in the way that they're going to. And you have it can happen. It's not guaranteed to happen, but it can happen that other people will catch on and will be inspired by what you're doing and will follow you into it. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you for the talk.
You're welcome.
So it seems from what you've said that persons who are engaged in jobs that appear outwardly successful, but are in fact meaningless, are certainly not free and certainly not successful in any real sense, and are certainly not making a positive difference, and are therefore certainly not ruling the world. But persons in the first class who may be suffering, but are free and are apparently making some kind of a positive difference, and are, even in human terms, actually more successful than some middle manager or subcontractor of a subcontractor who will not be remembered by anyone, are actually much closer to ruling the world than those who appear outwardly successful. So I'm wondering whether you think there is some kind of ruling the world that is in fact praiseworthy and desirable, and we're just looking at the wrong kind, or whether there is no such thing.
That's a beautifully formulated question. And I'm tempted to back out of it by saying, this is why I wasn't talking about ruling the world. I was talking about success. You know, are these people successful in the sense of living good lives? Yes. Are they more successful, living better lives than the other people? Yes. Are they living better lives than even the great billionaires, oligarchs that run our lives? Yes. But I think I have to think a bit about what ruling the world really means, because it doesn't sound right to me that a imprisoned poet is ruling the world. They're free, which is a kind of power. Freedom is a kind of power. It's a kind of self-rule, a kind of self-governance. But it doesn't seem like, I mean, I think if I went to the great world rulers, past or present, so Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, these guys who rule us now, who are not as charismatic. And I said, you know how you could really rule the world? Like writing poetry in a Siberian prison camp. I think they'd think that I wasn't offering them the same thing that they were looking for. So, so I want to resist. I want to resist saying that they're ruling the world most of all. But there are other words that I might use. That they're free. They have a certain kind of power within themselves. They're living good lives. That they're succeeding at being human. All of these things. But it would be fun if it were true. So I'll work on it. I'll see if I can, and you work on it too. See if you can't come up with a scheme whereby ruling the world means being a imprisoned poet. I would love to see. I would love to hear that argument. I would be dying to hear it. So anyway, keep working.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
I really appreciated how you spoke about the development in the 19th and early 20th century of the liberal education and how a big part of that was the appropriation of a classical education, which was for so long reserved for the upper class. And I wondered if you had thought about what else is there to appropriate, to uplift the working middle class. And in just like a brief minute of thought, my example was perhaps travel. I think there's great value in sort of seeing the world, seeing its history firsthand. So what else is still reserved just for the upper class that can be worked in to uplift the lives of the broader majority?
So I'm afraid in response to that question, I have to say something a bit dark. But you're young people, so you can go out and fix it when you rule the world. Wait a second. Don't want to get in contradiction. The truth is that this democratizing movement covered much more than intellectual life. So the free museum, the free concert, classical concert, the free opera. So in the UK, I think they still have the BBC Proms, right? These huge public concerts where the best classical music is played for, and anyone can go. But those traditions in the US have been deteriorating very quickly. So it's not just education, intellectual life; it's also arts and all of the things like that. So I'm not very old. I'm almost 50, but that's not really that old. You'll realize when you're this old, you'll realize it's not that old. But I've seen that aspect of our culture in the US get dramatically worse in my adult life. So I don't know what to do about that. I'm a college professor. I work on old books. I have a background in classical philosophy. So I work on trying to find ways to bring that to as broad an audience as I can. But it requires some as Tom mentioned, some entrepreneurial spirit and some good luck and some nice friends and things like that. And you know, it's not, there's no guarantee to it. But I think that a lot more needs to happen for the whole thing to shift back. And I don't know how it's going to happen. But I would like young people to think about it because I would like it to be different when I'm old. I would like to see a dip and then a return before I go the way of Croesus. So anyway, thanks for your question. But basically, every good human thing, if you're a good egalitarian, which I am, or I try to be, every good human thing should be available to anyone who, you know, who's a part of our community. Yeah, kind of a basic thought. But there's practicalities in there. But I think if you look at the actual circumstances of what's going on right now, I don't know that anyone who reflected on that question and looked at the way things are could really come away saying that things were working. It looks to me like a very, very dark situation for broad access to good things in life. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Hitz. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
The question I had was about it's like your like definition of happiness, because it seemed to me that it was very much connected to a kind of freedom from social expectations. And I was wondering if well, I agree partly with that. I was wondering if there might be also problems with like a complete freedom from social expectations. If we're again, and kind of the like the isolating effect that can have on an individual, or the problem of creating almost an ivory tower for oneself, separate from the problems of the world.
Beautiful question. Yes, of course. So the most famous example that I know, in at least among the things that I know of this, is the Stoic tradition, where you're so removed from the circumstances, which can change. Your values are so embedded in yourself that you no longer feel grief, for instance. And I find that, and you have friendships, and when your friends grieve, there's a notorious fact, you have to pretend that you're grieving with them, but you don't really think anything bad has happened, because the only good things can happen within you. So I think and I don't have a very perfectly developed theoretical account of this. It's something I've kind of worked on piecemeal and in a way that's a bit haphazard. My sense is that, and I was mentioning it a bit earlier in response to another question, human beings are basically social creatures. So take intellectual life, for instance. This is the thing I've thought about the most. So reading and studying. Okay, in a way, maybe you're sitting in your closet reading a book. You're very isolated. You're not in touch with the world around you. You're not connected. You're not responding. There may be situations you're ignoring because you're lost in your book. But there's a person in that book, the person who wrote it, who you're connecting with. And furthermore, the kinds of reflections that are being fed are things which can be shared and really sort of cry out to be shared, which is why intellectual community matters so much. Communities of study or communities of learning matter so much, because we kinds of things that we learn when we study can be shared with others. And that's true not just for books and ideas, but also for things like mathematics and science. So your mathematical theorems, your naturalistic observations, your physics, it's shareable with someone else, and it's appropriate to do that. So I think that it's a bit like the way I was talking about suffering. The initial detachment from the judgments of others is a kind of a means to an end. It frees you from this autopilot thing, which just drives you along and can set you in directions which are really not healthy or valuable or enduring in giving you any kind of flourishing. But once you are past that, there are other modes of connection that open themselves up to you, and they open up themselves up organically. Someone find me a new word for that. I hate it. But maybe I should just embrace, I come from Northern California, I should embrace my roots. It's organic. So that's my thought. I'm a big, I like community a lot. The community is really important. And I think it really is just kind of built into us and the things that we care about most, the things that matter to us most. And that's why, for instance, that the early question about family was so crucial, because, that's a case where someone's putting their highest value in their relationships with others. And that's one way of living a meaningful life.
We're doing over here first.
Well, thank you for coming. My question too is more about government work and how you would evaluate it. Because on one hand, and I say this because everyone here is wants to go into government, it feels. But on one hand, it feels like government work can be that great thing that's service to the community, and you're part of something larger. But on the other hand, I think of someone like Hannah Arendt's writings. It can be used horrifically but you could also be a cog in this soulless machine. So is it bullshit work? How would you evaluate it?
That's a great question. And I'm gonna, you've already kind of given me the punt. I'm gonna take it. So I think it depends on the kind of work it is. So, you're a local city councilman or something, like you're like up to your elbows in the activities of your community. It's absolutely not bullshit, it's service. If you're sort of working in the consultant, lobbyist, contractor machinery, you might just be moving money from one place to another and in a kind of elaborate game that is probably not serving the public good and might be doing it some harm. But it's also true that it's I think it's politics, because politics is in a democratically governed community like ours, where you're subject, your job depends in some way on the approval of others. Right? If you're elected or not elected, like even if you're appointed, your success or your lack of success depends on how other people see you. And so it is, I think, a bit more vulnerable than even other lines of work. There are certain lines of work where, and actually parts of academia are also like this, it's not just a politics thing. You get in this kind of hall of mirrors where everything is about what people think. And you have to be very careful in those areas. There's nothing, what will we do without politics? We need politics. You can't get rid of it. But especially now, I think it's showing a lot of the same corruption that other institutions have, apart from its own natural corruption. So it can be hard to find something that is truly meaningful. Although I like to think too, I mean, there's always, no one's quite asked me about this, but there's always different ways of living a particular job. So I imagine that over in the Capitol, there are some staffers who are actually just, maybe this is a romantic dream, but what they're doing is being incredibly kind and helpful to everyone they interact with. And just, like making people coffee and like being the person that they need to talk to at the right time. And now that's like being a chaplain. That's like the most beautiful work I can imagine. Now, are you in politics? Yes. Are you working in the Capitol? Yes. And almost any job can become like that, as long as it's not, as long as it involves interaction with human beings. Look for the people. That's what I would do. If you're going to go into politics, like interact with people. It'll help you out.
David kind of stole my question, but I'm gonna change it a little bit. I guess I wanted to ask a bit about the distinction between the meaningful life and the intellectual life, because it seems like these examples that you've given of people are all people who are to some extent living an intellectual life, even in a Siberian prison, or two of them in prison. Even in the patent office, Albert Einstein's living in an intellectual life. But could there be sort of living a meaningful life that doesn't involve that kind of component? And then if that's the case, then sort of what's necessary for a meaningful life? It seems like what's necessary for an intellectual life is a little clearer.
Yeah. Yeah, well, this is the problem when I wrote a book on intellectual life, and so all my examples, I should have pulled out some more. I think that I was trying to suggest that any kind of work that serves a human good, or and by work I mean very generally, it doesn't have to be work for pay, it could be work within your family, work taking care of your kids, work taking care of your elderly parents, any work like that is serving a human need is meaningful. So anyone who can do work like that, and we all can, has the meaning within their reach. Now, the more complicated question, which I tend to avoid, because I think every time I talk about it, I say something different. And I'm afraid that there's some compulsive doxographer out there cataloging everything I'm saying, and they're going to show up the contradictions. And it'll be like philosophy grad school all over again. And people, terrible. You contradicted yourself. Counterexample. But I think that intellectual life. So sorry. The complicated big question is whether there's one account of meaning that can tie together both these humble service type meanings and human relationship meanings and the intellectual life meanings. I suspect there is. I don't know how substantive it is, but if you, the traditional thought is contemplation is the highest end of human life. Now, contemplation has an intellectual end to it. You can contemplate the, highly complex mathematical physical theorems, but contemplation is also simple. You can contemplate the sky on your way to work. You can contemplate the splendor of another human being. You can contemplate the ways that your community has all these parts that fit together in certain ways, and different needs are met through different capacities. So my inclination is somewhere in that direction, that there's some kind of account that holds them together, and then it's contemplation. But I'm always reluctant to press too hard on it. I think the crucial thing is that there's and art and music. Those are another examples of what you call leisurely activity that you do for its own sake. But there's a lot of activities that you do for their own sake. It's not only reading and studying, intellectually life, narrowly speaking. Thank you for the question.
Zena, so can I ask you the last question since we're at time?
No.
Well, maybe there'll be, no, okay. Not
Absolutely
the last
not.
question.
No.
The questions will continue. Well, let me ask you this question.
Okay.
So I'm persuaded that that you're onto something with the idea that we need meaningful work, and that the definition of meaningful work are things that we do because we appreciate them for their own sake, and we love them for their own sake. And I think of this great saying that we have: if it's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And I think that what that implies is you can try at something. If you think the activity itself is worth doing, you can accept the fact that you're really lousy at playing guitar or whatever it is that you do. And that's the sign, in a way, that we're in the presence of something we think is an end for its own sake, right? So, but let's say that we agree that, and that there's a kind of liberation that comes from the kind of phenomenon that you're calling bullshit jobs. That when we say for ourselves, "Why I want to care about something for its own sake, not simply because someone else told me to," and that's a tremendously important thing for human beings to have that kind of liberation. But what happens if we are in a conversation, we agree that we need to have goods for their own sake, but it turns out that the candidates, there are multiple candidates, that they disagree with each other, that they might even be in a certain kind of conflict with each other. What if it's the sake that the human good is not a single thing, but that there's a kind of essential controversial character to it? How do we think about that?
That's great. I think it's once again a question that is a bit outside the scope of my intention, because what I want to do is to encourage people to reflect a bit on these kinds of questions. And I'm not trying to give them a particular answer about whether there is one good or there isn't. So sometimes the way I think about it is not that there is one human good, that if we study hard enough or receive the grace of God, we know what it is and we get it. But versus there's a list of goods, and maybe they're incompatible with each other, and we try for one and we get another one, and so on. What I tend to think is that there's a kind of imperfect grasp. There has to be, I'm persuaded by Aristotle, there has to be something which is dominating us, one thing. So now that means that we're obliged to reflect on whether we can control that thing, what that thing ought to be. And that reflection is an extremely laborious piecemeal process that it has to involve conversations with other people. Ideally, it involves reading a bunch of old books. Like it's not going to, and even if there were a list, say, of all the incompatible human goods, or a list, or somewhere it's written the human good, this is what it is, the right one for everyone. Even if it were there, it wouldn't make any difference because you had to persuade yourself that it was true. After all, for the kind of freedom I'm talking about to be true. So I think there's an open-ended search. It's a search for something that has to be singular because that's the way our lives are structured. How we end up coming down on the compatibility or incompatibility of various goods, or how we end up judging what that good is, it's going to end up being kind of a mess. I wouldn't expect it to be any other way, especially not when it's such a struggle even to ask the question and see that the question is worth asking. So I might be just telling you why I'm not that worried about that question, but I hope that's at least some step towards thinking about it.
Okay, I think our time is up. Not the last question, but our time is up. Can we say that, Zena? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, can you please join me in thanking Zena Hitz?